So, bienvenue à nouveau à la conférence, à l'école. So, welcome back. Today we have a couple of speakers. They are all distinguished members. More from France today and from Singapore, but nevertheless, all very well-known people in the field. And our first speaker needs little introduction. I'm not sure if people in Singapore knows about Marco Saitta. He's from Paris, Sorbonne, right?
Yes.
And yeah, it's written that Sorbonne here is Pierre Marie Curie. And he's going to talk about introduction to computational materials science at the University of Sorbonne. And as a general talk, and he's going to cover everything from density functional theory to machine learning methods. So Marco, if you are ready, you can start, but we could wait a couple of minutes.
Yes, I could start to start in a way. So first of all, thank you very much.
I need to say something. Marco is the chief organizer of this workshop. One of the chief.
Yes. Thank you, Kwek. Well, actually, what I would like to say to let a couple of minutes more pass, and I see that other people are just jumping in the waiting room, so we can probably still wait a couple of minutes. Yes, so the general words I'd like to say is that, yes, with Christian, we started to discuss about this school probably 1.5 years ago when I visited Singapore. It was March 2019. Seems like a million years ago, since we were free to travel and to go around the world, and now we are not. But still, it took a little time to try to start to think about which kind of event we wanted to do. So in the end, we realized that it was a good idea to have a school here. So that's why the banner still says HPC School on Quantum Computational Materials Science, even if the event we're running these days is not technically a school, but still it's a teaser for what the school will look like in a year from now. So the goal of this part of this event was a hybrid one in a way, that is partly a school in the sense that there are a lot of the supposed participants to both the Paris edition and the Singapore editions of the 2020 schools, so they can see a little bit about what they will learn about if they join the actual school next year. And that's why all talks today, yesterday, and today and tomorrow have a sort of pedagogical part in which we give a general introduction that will be familiar to most of the confirmed scientists, but still useful for young scientists, young students to start to get their foot into this field. And yes, so and that's also an opportunity to present a little bit of our ongoing research. Also, specifically, my presentation today will be even more pedagogical, I would say. The very final part will be on research going on, because, yes, yesterday we had Michele Casula's talk from Paris, and it was the first talk in which, from the quantum approaches that are, of course, since they are very costly from the computational point of view, Michele's talk yesterday was really the first one trying to use these quantum-based, fully quantum methods to study real system and not models. So Michele showed something about actual water clusters, so which are a step beyond the models that we saw in the earlier part. They are, of course, very, very complex models. So today, the name of the session is Computational Materials Physics, and tomorrow is computational materials chemistry. And the idea of my talk today is to provide this DFT general background that is very general and which paves the way somehow to all, to most, not all probably, but most talk today and most talk tomorrow. And then, of course, my Parisian colleagues today and tomorrow will hopefully develop their own lectures without the necessity of laying down the framework of density functional field. Okay, so that's why this talk is a very general title, this introduction. So, and if I may start, let me first say who I am, because as Quek said, I'm with Christian, one of the, and also with, of course, Quek and Dario, one of the organizers of this school. Let me say a word to thank Yvonne and Cassandra for helping us. I mean, of course, we will speak about the general remarks about the school tomorrow in the closing remarks, but still it's important for me to say this. So I do my research in Sorbonne University, CNRS and Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle at the Institute of Mineralogy, Physics of Materials and Cosmochemistry. And here I also speak under the Maestro collaboration, which is a collaboration, a consortium from the Institute for the Science of Calculations and Data in Sorbonne University. And of course, the reason why I'm here is that my expertise is what we call ab initio modeling of computation in condensed matter physics, chemistry, and material science, so a broad domain which covers different aspects of computational material science. And in fact, all around my career, I've focused my research on some exotic properties of molecular crystals, such as superionic ices. This is an ammonia ice at the conditions of the interior of planets, such as Neptune and Uranus, where you see the nitrogen atoms are fixed in their lattice position, but one hydrogen atom, the only one I show, moves around as it were in a liquid. This is something we did on salty, on the synthesizing, predicting and synthesizing salty ices. In my past, I've also worked on with graphene and nanotubes, which we'll see a little bit about later on, and in particular some non-adiabatic properties. I will say a word about adiabaticity in a moment. And then the bulk of my research today is pretty much what is carried out in the Maestro Consortium, which I will say a word about in a moment. And basically is to use topology and topology-based concepts to study general transformations in a matter as this simple phase transition indicated here. The beauty of our methods is that they apply to many other things than physics or material science. For example, we have a collaboration in my group with NASA studying the physical origins of biological life. So it's even if I will not talk about that today, but my friend Fabio Di Rucci will say something about that tomorrow. And then something which is really the latest part of my research is using machine learning methods to computational material science, because we just created in Sorbonne a big center for artificial intelligence, and that's part of this project is under the influence of this Sky Center. So let me say also a word about this computational material science, because the idea of this school in Singapore today originated some years ago when with Rodolphe, who is also present here and he will talk tomorrow. We created the Paris International School on Advanced Computational Material Science in 2015. And the idea was to put together a generation of computational physicists and chemists in Paris who are working together to present a broad panel of methods for computational material science, going from mesoscopic methods to quantum Monte Carlo, which we saw yesterday from Michele Casula. And the idea, of course, of any school is to share our knowledge and to pass it to younger generations of new scientists in our field. And so this is the general broad panel of what we traditionally present in Paris. The 2020 edition should have been the first one in which we would have introduced machine learning methods. Of course, this edition never took place, but it's only something we will do later on in the next few years. And so this is the list of Parisian colleagues that participate to this school. Color code are to say physicists in blue, from chemists in green. So there are several labs here in the Sorbonne University. So and that's a very nice inter-laboratory collaboration, which again is going on for more than 5 years. So we had 5 Parisian editions. We had already 1 edition in Bangalore almost 3 years ago. We should have had these 2 editions in Paris and Singapore this year, which never took place. We hopefully will have the 2021 editions both in Paris end of August and in Singapore, same week, very likely second week in November. And then there are discussions about going back to Bangalore again and possibly to Abu Dhabi. So that's the general idea of what the kind of work we've been doing on this series of schools in the last few years. Let me say also a word about this Maestro Consortium, because the idea of schools in general is to, of course, to pass our knowledge to younger generation, and that's the first goal. That's very important. But something that can also be a side result, but a very nice one from these schools, is that we can build also new collaborations among colleagues. And that was also the idea both of doing the Singapore school and of doing these events, that because we even among more expert scientists, we can get to know each other, and we can probably create opportunities to build new scientific collaboration. And actually this Maestro Consortium, again, which is within the Institute for Science of Calculation and Data in Sorbonne University, is the acronym for Materials for Energy through Stochastic Sampling and High Performance Computing, really is a child of the Computational Materials Science School. We got to know each other organizing this school, and then a few years later, it takes time in the French system to actually build collaboration, especially having money. We were able to build this Maestro collaboration. Again, we are not all the people that are present in the school, but many of them, Michele, Fabio, Benjamin, myself, Mathieu, Rodolphe, and also other people from the mathematics or computer science departments. We built this collaboration because we want to go at the heart of mathematical problems in doing dimensionality reduction, something we will not see today in my talk, but you will see a bit of tomorrow in Fabio Petrucci's talk, not only. And also, so we have 2 main research lines. One is really a mathematical one. Second one is a bit more applied, and the focus of this collaboration are energy storage materials, in which in any time and all the time you have transformation of a given material from one phase to the other. One phase is where the phase in which you store the energy, the other phase is the one in which you release the energy. So this idea is to study this kind of phenomena from a very general mathematics and then computer science perspective. Okay, so let's go finally to actual science. And so this is a little bit of the general overview of my own scientific interest, again with Fabio Petrucci, who's my closest collaborator. And in general, we are interested in generalized structural transformation in condensed matter physics and chemistry. And by transformation, we have phase transitions, like in storage materials, but also other systems, nucleation, chemical reactions in solution, and even, it is more Fabio than myself, protein structure-function relation. All phenomena in which there's a state of matter that changes into another state of matter. And to do that, what we use is the general tool is computer simulation using ab initio, that is quantum-based molecular dynamics. And so today I will present just one emblematic case of using ab initio molecular dynamics. I will skip these two parts because you will see they are very interesting, but you will see a little bit of that, a lot of that in Fabio's talk tomorrow. And I will go straight through. So the first challenge is the one that Fabio will present tomorrow, and which is at the heart of the Maestro collaboration. The latter one, I will say a word today because we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are starting to use machine learning methods a bit differently from what Dario showed yesterday in quantum wave functions. We are starting to use them to replace, in a way, costly ab initio simulations by some more efficient way to study math. So, in the spirit of the school, I will just start saying a word about length scales here from the nanometer to the meter, and time scales here from the picosecond to the macroscopic scale. And so this is the progression that we generally indicate. So the realm of electronic structure calculation, that is quantum-based ab initio calculation, is really this one. So of course it's a very short time and length scale. Another way to see that, focusing on calculation methods, is again, this is only a length scale on this side, so we only stop at the macrometer here. And the green part is everything that we call atomistic methods, in which we have the individuality of each atom. That is, each atom is treated as a separate entity, while when you go beyond, you start to work with continuous models. And in general, we have molecular classical Monte Carlo and molecular dynamics. But then when you need to use quantum mechanics, you have to go down in the scale, and you have to use what we call either hybrid methods or fully ab initio calculation. But then when you go into the ab initio world, again, another way to see this, you can, if you are only interested in structural and dynamical properties, that is atomic trajectories, you can still use empiric interatomic potentials. But once the electronic properties are important, that is just, for example, in changing the phase of a system or the reactivity of the system or whatever, you need to include electronic properties, and that's you can still do something semi-empirical use of quantum mechanics. But if you really need to have explicit electrons, you need to do ab initio method, that is DFT, or even more advanced wave function based methods such as quantum Monte Carlo or post-Hartree-Fock quantum chemistry approaches. So I will skip. So yesterday we heard a lot about the more advanced, more accurate, but also more costly approaches. Particularly in the end, we had quantum Monte Carlo methods. Today I will go a little bit up in the scale. That is, I will just do a quick introduction on ab initio DFT density functional theory calculations in the computational materials science physics community. Ab initio and DFT are almost used as synonyms. They are not technically, but the jargon is that we use them as really as the word synonym. So the principle of ab initio calculation is that the interactions among atoms are only determined by electronic structure of atoms. That is, we need to go through the solution of the quantum mechanical equation of motion for the electrons, which give us all the quantum energy and forces. And then, so in this sense, the only input we need to do ab initio calculation is the atomic number. And that if we have silicon in a surface or in the bulk or in a nanoparticle, the silicon atom is the same. And so we thanks to, in principle, with ab initio method, we can use the same silicon atom in all these different conditions. In a word, our calculation must be transferable. And of course, but to do that, we need a special theoretical framework, that is the framework of DFT. The advantage of doing ab initio calculations is that we can use the same approach throughout disciplines. We can do biology a little bit, planetary interiors, and also, of course, material science, just with the same framework, the same, even the same calculation code. And again, we can dig into electronic properties, chemical reaction, change of coordination. We have a great accuracy at the nanoscale and even below. And also something which is very useful in a quantitative perspective is that we can directly simulate in a fully ab initio fashion experimental spectra, that is X-ray, Raman, infrared, NMR, and even more advanced experimental spectra. And to give an idea, this is the kind of accuracy that we have, whether it's on position, bonding energies, vibrational frequencies, and so forth and so on. So on the other side, the typical system size we can deal with is of the order at most of 1,000 atoms. When you have 1,000 atom calculation, even with supercomputers, start to become costly. And typical time scales are okay. This number core is can be a bit larger, but still, we are generally easy on the tens of picoseconds. When you need to do hundreds or thousands of picoseconds, it starts to become demanding. So let's again, this is not supposed to be a full course on DFT. Just a quick ideas to fix something that you will then be able to understand better when my colleagues will discuss. In general, the problem that we saw also yesterday from the quantum matter talks is that we have, even if we take the simplest time-independent, non-relativistic, spinless Schrödinger equation, we have this kind of Hamiltonian, and we need to solve this eigenvalue equation to get the many-body wave function and the eigenvalues. And the problem is that this Hamiltonian is the sum of n, if we have n electrons, a sum of n one-electron operators, the kinetic operators and the Coulomb interaction of each electron with the nuclei, and this is the easy part. But then we also have this electron-electron interaction here, which is a big problem because it's long-range, and especially because it makes a quantum interaction among particles, and so which makes an entanglement, and thus the fact that our wave function is many-body and cannot be because of the interaction between all the electrons. So you cannot factorize your wave function into single particle orbitals. You need to handle, in principle, a large wave function like this one. And this is a big problem because, yes, of course, you can say, okay, we are in 2020, we have big computers, we can try to solve it numerically by brute force. Problem is, this is easier said than done, because if you take almost the simplest possible example, a lithium-3 clusters. So here we have 9 electrons in total, 3 per atom. So we can try to solve it numerically by brute force. We still need to solve the Schrödinger equation on a special grid. So we need to have n by n by n grid for each coordinate, for each electronic coordinate. And if we take a grid of 0.5 angstrom, which is not very fine, if you think that the regular distance should be about 2 angstrom, it's easy to see that just to make one single psi h psi calculation, we need 10 to the 29 operation, which means that even on teraflop computers, this will take several billion years just to do this single calculation. So we cannot go brute force. We have to do something else. We saw yesterday that with advanced quantum models, we can study ideal problems, models, or application to small systems like the one that Michele Casura introduced yesterday. To go beyond the models or very small system, we can use density functional theory. We have to go work in the adiabatic approximation, precisely the one that Michele could neglect yesterday in treating in a quantum fashion the nuclei of the water clusters. But in general, we do that because since electrons are much lighter and faster than nuclei, the time scales are shorter, so we can typically use quantum equation of motions for electrons, but classical ones for nuclei. Still, even if we restrict to the electrons' degrees of freedom, we have a many-body wave function, and as I just mentioned, the size of the many-body wave function grows exponentially with the number of electrons, so it becomes easily, quickly unbearable. So the idea of DFT is that we can have this quantity, the electron density in real space, which from the formal point of view is built as this special integral of the square modulus of the many-body wave function. And the advantage of the electron density is that it only has 3 spatial coordinates, and the number of spatial coordinates, the real space coordinates, is independent on the number of electrons. Still, whatever the number of electrons, still you have one definition of the electron density in real space is measurable, which is a useful property, and many physical quantities, not all, but many physical quantities can be inferred from the electron density. So the DFT idea is to reformulate the many-body electron problem in terms of this electron density. I will skip all the theorems and stuff because it will be a matter in next year when we'll do the school. Let's just say that we can build an energy functional. This energy here, the total energy of the system is a functional of this electron density, where we have a kinetic part, an external part, which corresponds basically to this operator here, an external part which describes the interaction between the electron system and the external world, including the Coulomb charges of the nuclei, and then an internal energy, which basically is the representation, the formal representation of this interaction here. The external part is easy to express in terms as a functional of the electron density, is simply given by this integral, so this is really an easy part. The internal energy, we can split it in a mean field part, which we call the Hartree interaction, which is the classical interaction between electron densities, described like here, where the electron density at R and the electron density of R prime. So this is a classical term that we can easily build as a functional of this electron density. The problem is that, this is pretty much it of what we can easily express in terms of electron charge density. And to go beyond, we have to do what Kohn-Sham did in 1964, that is to map the real interacting problem in which the wave function is many-body because of the quantum interaction among electrons, into a fictitious system where the electrons are non-interacting, so their wave function can be factorized, but that corresponds, that has a one-to-one correspondence with the real system of real interacting electrons. Again, I will skip the details because this is not the place to do that. But still, this fictitious system allows us to build a kinetic energy, which is the one from non-interacting single particle orbitals, and to put everything that is related to the quantum interactions among orbitals, both from the kinetic part and from the U part, from the interaction part, within a single term, that we call exchange and correlation. Which,
Marco, you have 5 more minutes.
Yes, which hides inside all the things that we don't know about this quantum interaction. So we can rewrite this energy functional as this. So this is the 2 parts that we can easily deal with. The Hartree part here, and then the external part here. And then we put these 2 unknown terms inside this exchange correlation function, and then we finally get our full energy function like this: the non-interacting kinetic energy, the external part here, the Hartree term here, and then the 2 terms we don't know about in this exchange correlation. This allows us to rewrite the many body problem into a little quick here, into a single independent single particle equation like this one. And since these single particles are much easier to handle, we can easily build this, find the numerical solution of this equation here, and then go back to the total energy. Once we have the total energy, which is pretty much what Dario or Michele said yesterday about this psi h psi expectation value. This is basically the expectation value reformulated in DFT terms. Then we can have access to forces, energy and forces, and then we can finally do what we call molecular dynamics, that is to move our atoms classically. So this is Newton's equation, just taking the gradients of this potential here, which is the potential, basically the potential energy, the electronic potential energy in which live our atoms. From molecular dynamics, this is something that Fabio will tell you about tomorrow, but from molecular dynamics, we can, from trajectories and the ergodicity theorem, we can have access to probability of any given observable that can be expressed in terms of the atomic positions and atomic coordinates, and so we have access in principle to all the free energies. So now I'll quickly present a very quick application of this ab initio molecular dynamics methodology, and then I'll skip to the end. So this is a quick word about the thesis of my former PhD, Mathieu Moog. So the interest is on the geological cycle, geochemical cycle of CO2 from the bottom of from the inside of the Earth through the atmosphere, and because CO2 is a system that in the green shaded region here, which is the condition of the inside of the Earth, it's in a fluid form, but a fluid which is known to go through from a molecular form to a polymeric form, and very little is known about that because, of course, these conditions of temperature and pressure are very extreme, so experiments are very, very difficult. So to make the long story short, we calculated, we did ab initio molecular dynamics calculations throughout this phase diagram, 45 different points and 100 picoseconds per point, so well beyond, these are only the good trajectories, but well beyond 5 nanoseconds of ab initio trajectories all in all. And in the end, we were able to characterize this phase diagram, a molecular fluid, a reactive fluid, molecular fluid, a polymeric fluid, and then a glassy part. This is not the, I mean, I'll go quickly here just to tell you that this is something that we can still do with just using ab initio molecular dynamics, but at a big cost because we have to perform more than 5 nanoseconds of trajectory, which is a lot. And still we can get very good results, but we need to go beyond. One way to go beyond is to do this part here, to find smart ways to overcome kinetic and thermodynamic barriers. That's something that Fabio will discuss tomorrow. But the other problem is that these ab initio calculations, so based on DFT, are very costly, and we will be very happy to avoid them. And so to go in a way from the quantum, to still keep a quantum description of matter, but be able to extrapolate this throughout all these scales to have a good perspective on the larger scales. So to put it in a nutshell, the problem is that when we have very good accuracy beyond DFT, we only have small systems and basically no dynamics. When you do DFT, you have larger system, you lose in accuracy, you have larger system and short dynamics, and ideally you would like to have still quantum accuracy, but classical force field efficiency to deal with millions of atoms and microsecond trajectories. So that's why we do machine learning. And also because not only ab initio calculations are very costly, but they also scale poorly with the number of particles in the system. DFT is about third order. Quantum Monte Carlo is about fourth power. And if you do more advanced approaches, the scaling is even worse. So the idea is that also we have nanosecond trajectories at the best, and we'd like to go further than that. And to give an idea, all the simulations that I presented in the CO2 case, there are about 2.5 million supercomputing hours, which means just for running the calculation, besides exploiting and analyzing, is a lot of human time, really a lot. So this is a major bottleneck. And the idea of using machine learning in this field is that pretty much as we use neural network to recognize the picture of a dog from the picture of a cat, or to recognize handwritten numbers, we can try to recognize atomic configurations and crash out the energy without doing the calculations. So feeding our neural network a bunch of trajectories, that is correspondence between atomic configurations and energies and forces calculated ab initio, and then be able to recognize new trajectories just from the training we did on older one, which is also a good method, a good approach to exploit the many long ab initio trajectories we all have in our hard disks. So again, I'll keep the long story short. Of course, we can just, this is more than a fit. A classical model potential do fits since a long time. A word to mention Jörg Beller, with whom we work in a framework of the PhD thesis of Julian E. And to build this neural network potential, we have no a priori knowledge and choice of the mathematical form of the potential, which is a good advantage in terms of flexibility and a disadvantage in terms of physical control of the system. So it's something to handle with care. And in general, we have a local perspective that is we try to build this total energy of a system as a sum of individual atomic energies. So we applied this to CO2, the same CO2 for which we had all these ab initio trajectories. Again, I skipped the details. We heard a little bit yesterday, and I can answer a question later in case. The good point is that we were able to have a good fitting properties. So this is the true value, the DFT value, and this is the predicted value from our neural networks. And even the structures, the carbon-carbon distribution function, the carbon-oxygen distribution function, and the oxygen-oxygen distribution function are very well predicted by the neural networks. This is a lot of work in progress, so I cannot show any more details than this. So I'll just keep to conclusions. And these conclusions are supposed to be a little bit general. Let's say that we I mean, many people in this field are interested in interesting phenomena. That is, in general, structural transformation are interesting phenomena in material science. There's a large community using ab initio method, in particular ab initio molecular dynamics. There are bottlenecks and challenges to solve this bottleneck we will hear about tomorrow. One of the two main challenges, in my view, is ab initio simulation. So that's what we are trying to do to overcome this bottleneck here. So let me thank my collaborators on this project, Fabio Petrucci and Michele Casula from my lab, and Jörg Beller from Göttingen, and the three former and present PhD students involved in this project, and my lab and the ECSD institution. And thank you all for your attention.
See. Any questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah. No.
So how useful are linear scaling Cohen-Sham methods for your applications?
Well, let's say that DFT. Let me go back 1 second. DFT was invented, formalized in 1963 by two theorems that actually prove, that you can get to this functional here. That is, you can, if you mean that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the electron density and the external potential. And so if you know the ground state electron density, you have in principle access to the full Hamiltonian, and so to the energy value, eigenvalues of the Hamiltonian. So there are mathematical theorems that guarantee you that. The idea of Kohn-Sham is that when you do this mapping here, which of course I have no time to describe here, there is an approximation. The approximation is, of course, within this exchange correlation functional, which is generally treated as an exchange correlation function. It is in a local way in what is called the local density approximation, and there are corrections to the local density approximations. But still, once you have a way to treat this function here, yes, you get to this linear set of Kohn-Sham equation, which of course you solve in an iterative way. So there's still it's a problem where your wave function.
Sorry.
Yes.
So I was not speaking about the linearity of the Schrödinger equation, but the cubic scaling with particle number
Okay.
of the Kohn-Sham method. So there are some linear scaling methodologies for Kohn-Sham, which might be used. Just was wondering whether you have tried.
Of course, there are order n. Sorry, it's later. So sorry, I misunderstood your question. There are of course order n approaches. Again, they don't keep the full DFT inside. There are several codes around that do almost order n, and even there's a way to do ab initio molecular dynamics, which is called Carparinello, which goes better than n to the power 3. Still, my point is that even if you have a very good scaling, if you want to study a problem in which the accuracy is crucial, precisely as, for example, the ones that Michele Casula described yesterday, or even some of the problems we deal with in our group when we do certain chemical reactions, and you will see about that with Fabio tomorrow. Scaling is rarely order n. Scaling is order n where the electron part is not can be handled with more easiness, if I may say. And in general, even besides the scaling, still you want to use better than ab initio and to exploit your several trajectories.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? So a more general question is between density functional method and semi-empirical method based on Hartree-Fock. How do they compare? I would think that Hartree-Fock will not use the same accuracy as DFT.
Well, the problem, there's the reason why historically there's been a split in a way between the physicists and the chemists with methods is that chemical methods are based at least loosely on a Hartree-Fock approach. They are wave function based.
Yes.
And, of course, there are post-Hartree-Fock methods, MP2 and configuration interaction, a couple cluster, and so forth and so on. The problem with Hartree-Fock is that if you do simple Hartree-Fock in the electron gas, you get a non-metallic behavior. So to do condensed matter physics, in general, Hartree-Fock methods are not very good. While they are very good in doing localized problems, which are, of course, the bulk of chemical problems. Physics, the reason why Hartree-Fock has never become popular is because all of solid state physics and all of DFT in physics has been built on electron density, which is on the electron gas. So, I mean, you still have to deal properly with metals. That's why DFT is very good in general with metals. And so that's why there was this historical split between these two communities.
Other questions? Actually, we have stretched beyond the time allocated because Marco was talking a little bit about other things at the beginning of the talk. So I didn't take that time into account. Yeah, okay. So if not, then I think we can wrap it up and thank Marco for his excellent talk.
Thank you.
Right. Yes, thank you very much. And we invite Adam Shaffique to give his talk. Adam, you're there? You can share your screen. Yes.
Okay. Do you hear me? Do you see my screen?
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
You see the beautiful landscape.
All right.
Okay. So thank you for giving me a chance to talk at the school. As I will start a little bit pedagogical, and then I will sort of move into the kind of research areas that I'm interested in. So I thought I'd just begin by telling you the kind of problems that I'm interested in studying. So, you know, the kinds of things I look at are electronic properties of materials that sort of combine topological bands where there is disorder. And, you know, disorder breaks translation invariance. So many of the techniques that people use all assume translation invariance, and that breaks down when you have disorder. And of course, as Marco very nicely discussed, and I will also, you know, there'll be some repetition, which is, I think, good. I will give some of the same examples that he gave when talking about correlations. And then, of course, looking at some of the overlap between these areas. So what happens when you combine topology with correlations? What happens when you combine disorder with topology and disorder with correlations? And today I'll sort of focus on this topology and correlations, but I just want to point out that yesterday you heard Pinaki Sengupta talk, and he and I have a collaboration on looking at money boy localization, which is an intersection between disorder and correlations. And I spent a lot of time, you know, working on disorder and topology, and I'm happy to talk about that. We even have a review article in RevMod Phys from 10 years ago where we discussed this idea of topology and disorder. So that's kind of where my interests lie. So oops. Okay, my screen is frozen. Okay, there. So, you know, what is band topology? So since this is a sort of a school, I'll sort of start at the very beginning. When I was a PhD student, there was no such thing. I mean, topology was not a fashionable area in condensed matter physics. So we had, so for example, we had this Atland and Zinnbauer 10-fold way of classifying all non-interacting Hamiltonians based on symmetry. So if you were, you know, if you were ignoring interactions, you could identify every system as belonging to one of these symmetry classes. And then, you know, a fashionable technique back then was to sort of build random matrices that have the same symmetry and use random matrix theory to try and determine the properties of these systems. And that's something that I did during my PhD. You fast forward to today, and you see the same 10 classes. So if you look at the names, the Cartan label, those 10 labels are the same, but now you see a lot of topological indexes. Z means it's an integer topology, and Z2 means it has a twofold, two classes, topological and trivial. And many of the systems that were not previously thought of in this family now find their way in there. So the integer quantum Hall effect, where you have these, you know, you have a Z topological index characterizing the edge modes of the quantum Hall effect, or the Su-Schiefer-Heeger model for polyacetylene, where you again have a Z index, or the quantum spin Hall effect, Majorana fermions, 3 topological insulators. I mean, all these new topological modes sort of found their way into this classification of systems. And this is sort of a nice way to sort of look back and see things in a neat framework. But I just want to sort of say that you know, this ideas of band topology, while they were known for a long time, and you know, there's the famous paper by TNNK and Haldane, it was actually studying graphene with spin orbit coupling in this paper by Kane and Meili that discovered this Z2 topological order in the quantum spin Hall effect. And from there, we sort of, it became realized that this was just one example of a symmetry class bifurcating into topological and non-topological. And, you know, one general feature of topological order is that there's a d-dimensional system with topology then you have a d-1 dimensional surface state. So for example, if you're studying the surface state of a 3D topological insulator, that's a 2D Dirac fermion, which is the same kind of system that we study in graphene. So there are these connections between real materials like graphene and the surface states of a 3D topological insulator like bismuth selenide. Also, the one big problem is this fate of the tenfold classification in the presence of interactions is still an open problem. There are some examples and notable work by Kitaev that show that topology is not preserved interactions. But again, what happens to topology interactions is something that sort of is currently an area of open research. So, and you know, there's this paper by Bernavig and collaborators from last year that sort of tried to use symmetry analysis to look at what all the materials were known in a database and identify which of them are topological. And they found like roughly 1/3 of all materials that are topological. So in some sense, topology is no longer something that's sort of very exotic. We went from you know, a few isolated examples like the quantum Hall effect and the Sushi-Verheeger model to now a situation where we believe at least 1/3 of all materials in nature are topological. So it's sort of a evolution in how we think about this system. Okay, so again, as I said, I will focus on Dirac fermions in 2 dimensions, but that's sort of there are many systems that sort of have the Dirac fermion. So for example, you know, carbon monoxide and coral on copper forms a honeycomb lattice, and that's sort of described by Dirac fermions. I said earlier that the bismuth selenide, the 3D topological insulator surface states, but also magic angle twisted bilayer graphene, organic conductors, and so on and so forth. So now let's talk about interactions. So what are interactions? So, you know, electrons are charged objects and they interact with the Coulomb interaction. So when electrons are very far from each other, they have a 1/r Coulomb tail. And this Coulomb tail is known to, for example, if it becomes very strong, to give you Wigner crystallization, which sort of means the electrons, they spontaneously break translational symmetry and form a crystal due to the Coulomb interactions. And the electrons sort of want to be as far away from each other as possible. However, on very short scale, you have the Coulomb interaction gets cut off by the lattice scale physics, and that's called a Hubbard U term. And we know that a Hubbard U term, for example, if on a square lattice or a honeycomb lattice, if you turn up a Hubbard U, you get a Mott insulator. And so when we talk about sort of this Coulomb interaction, in some sense, as I'll describe later, we're sort of talking about 2 components of this Coulomb interaction, a very lattice scale Hubbard U and a long range tail, which is sort of this Wigner crystal. And, you know, again, here you'll sort of exactly repeating some of the things that that Marco said in his talk, right? I mean, the problem about this electron-electron interactions, or the many body problem, is that it's computationally hard. So, you know, Marco gave the example of lithium, where you had 3 interacting electrons, and he showed that you had a phase space of a very large phase space of wave functions. This is sort of the paper from Walter Cohen's Nobel Prize, where he sort of was awarded for inventing the method that Marco uses, the ab initio density functional theory. And in his paper, he basically sort of lays out what he calls the exponential wall. And he gives an example here. Let's try and solve the many-body problem for 100 particles. And he shows that a wave function approach would require parameters like 10 to the power 150 parameters. And sort of the conclusion is that no amount of advance in computer science will allow you to minimize the space of 10 to the power 150 dimensionality. And so, again, the key idea, okay, and then, in modern context, we talk about this in terms of complexity classes, and you can see this, the quantum class is actually more complex than either P or NP, and so the issue is that it's a computationally hard problem. And I guess the one take-home message is that if you want to solve, in general, the many-body problem for electrons, it's sort of good luck, right? I mean, you're not going to be able to solve it. For a strongly correlated many electron system, it's sort of an unsolvable problem with the computational techniques that we have today. But the key idea is that for some specific problems, you do have algorithms, and the algorithms that you're learning about in the school. I believe that Pinaki and others talked about quantum Monte Carlo yesterday. Marco talked about density functional theory today. For particular problems, there are efficient algorithms that allow you to sort of solve the problem. And I guess a key insight is to try and understand which techniques are there out there, and you're learning about some of them in the school, or when you have the school in next year, you will learn about some of these techniques. But you need some sort of an insight as to which problems can be addressed by which techniques, and that's something that sort of again, that's sort of the frontier of what we're doing in research. Okay. The other thing I want to sort of talk about today is sort of give you a paradigm of twisted Morey graphene. And so, if people aren't familiar with this, this is where you take one sheet of graphene and take another sheet of graphene and you twist them relative to each other. And when you sort of have very large twist angles, you sort of form, you can get a super lattice that's, maybe a factor of 3 or 4 times the original lattice. When you go to very, very small angles, so for example, here shown is 2.3 degrees, you can get a lattice period that's several, almost a factor of 20 or 30, even as far as a factor of 100, larger than the original lattice scale. And so you can sort of change the relevant energy scale in these systems depending on this twist angle. So it's a very interesting system to sort of study. And I talked earlier about the Coulomb interaction. One can sort of show that the Hubbard U diverges in the system, the long-range tail RS diverges, and something that'll become important for the rest of my talk, the Fermi surfaces become highly anisotropic. And so this is sort of an interesting system with lots of rich physics, and one that I'll talk about later in the talk. But the idea is that this graphene or twisted layer graphene is just one example of a 2D material. There's theoretically, they predicted that there are about 1,000 easily exfoliated 2D materials. And now you can build them up in 3 dimensions. You can have twist angles between them. And when the twist angles between different layers is different, you can get sort of 2 Morey potentials, super Morey potentials. And again, these systems, because they have the block period is, the block period is very large, it's actually very difficult to have any kind of computational techniques to try and solve them. Even the non-interacting problem becomes intractable. And so what happens to interactions in the system is sort of a frontier of what we're thinking about right now. And I think, something that's sort of a very exciting area of current research. Okay, and the kind of work that's been done to date is sort of very piecemeal. So for example, you look at what happens when you put graphene on graphene. That's what I talk about, twisted bilayer graphene, or you put black phosphorus on graphene, or you put transition colchonite on graphene, or boron nitride on graphene. But you sort of have these things where you look at the systems individually, but some sort of a big picture of how to understand these systems and the correlation of the systems is sort of something that's completely at its infancy at present. Okay, with that, that was sort of the pedagogical part of the talk. And now I sort of want to give you sort of 2 examples of where we use computational methods to sort of understand the role of correlations or interactions in this graphene-like system, these topological systems. And we'll look at sort of two particular problems. One is the idea of Fermi velocity normalization, and that was done, I know Pinaki is in the audience, and that was done in collaboration with Pinaki. And the other one is sort of anisotropy normalization, and that was done by in collaboration with Fakir-Assad. So the general question is the following. If you have a Hamiltonian that's the Dirac form, so you sort of have a sigma dot k, that's a Dirac Hamiltonian in 2 dimensions, and you add correlations, what could happen to the Hamiltonian? So one can show by by very general considerations that your Hamiltonian can be written, an interacting Hamiltonian can be written of the form below, where you could open up a gap, and again, this gap could be of the Kane-Milli, could be of the Kane-Milli type, or it could be the Kane-Milli type, or it could be a trivial gap. But you could also have a change in the Fermi velocity. So the question I want to address in this sort of work is, what happens to this Fermi velocity in the presence of interactions? Okay, so again, when we started this problem, I told you that earlier that there's sort of two ways to think of the Coulomb interaction. One is this short-range part of the Hubbard interaction, which is this Hubbard U. And there was earlier work by, for example, by Sandro Sorella and collaborators, where they showed that as you change the Hubbard U, again, this work was done with quantum Monte Carlo, you get a critical U, UC, which is about 3.8, for which you move from a semi-metal, where the system is metallic, to where you open up a gap and get an antiferromagnet. And so you have a transition between a semi-metal and an antiferromagnet at some critical value of the Hubbard U. There's other work that shows that in perturbation theory in U, so again, one of the techniques we have is sort of many-body perturbation theory. In many-body perturbation theory, there is no change in the Fermi velocity to first order in first order in U. So that was another result that was known. So again, the idea is that it is a non-perturbative metal to insulator transition induced by the Hubbard U. There's also work that goes back to the 1950s by Freeman Dyson. And he was interested in quantum electrodynamics. And he wrote this very short paper. I think the paper is by 1 page, where he basically says that he's going to present an argument to show that QED is uncontrolled. And in our system, Dirac fermions in 2 dimensions, it's exactly the same as QED, except our coupling constant is much stronger. It's 2 instead of 1/137. And so the argument sort of goes like this: sort of write down a perturbative expansion for your self-energy, or any quantity you're calculating. Typically we calculate self-energies, and you write it in terms of this coupling constant, alpha. And if you write down a perturbation theory, you sort of for the theory to be convergent, so the first step is, imagine now a system where you look at alpha being an artificial system where alpha is negative. So instead of the Coulomb interactions being repulsive, the Coulomb interactions are attractive. Well, then if you imagine adding a particle, that particle will attract to another particle and form a sort of a cluster or a clump, a sort of a puddle, and that will then break down your assumption of a homogeneous theory. And so the system has an instability for negative alpha. And then you can use the rules of sort of of an expansion, a series expansion, to show that if it's not analytically continuous at 0, then the series must break down. And you can estimate that it sort of breaks down in 137th order of perturbation theory. So if you were, in QED, the theory that we know for electrodynamics, if you go to 137th order in perturbation theory, the theory is believed to be divergent and uncontrolled. But for Dirac fermions with the long-range Coulomb interaction, it's much worse. This divergence happens in the first order of perturbation theory. So in some sense, any diagrammatic theory is uncontrolled for Dirac fermions. Okay, so the first question we sort of try to ask is, can we use the same quantum Monte Carlo methods that were used by people like Sorella and Assad and others to ask what happens when you sort of combine both a Hubbard U and a long-range interaction? And so what we find is that you still get this semi-metal to multi-insulator transition, and we can trace out how that transition changes. So for example, as you increase the long-range interaction, the semi-metal becomes more stable, and you push this line out to larger values of Hubbard U. Then we can sort of ask what happens when U is very, very small. And in that limit, we sort of find that perturbation theory, sort of the random phase approximation, which is a semi-analytic method, but also, usually once you go into the level of diagrams that we're looking at, you sort of do it numerically. Sort of the quantum Monte Carlo data agrees with the random phase approximation very, very well. And you can sort of see the first order perturbation theory, second order perturbation theory, and the RPA. And so you can see that the quantum Monte Carlo reproduces the RPA for very, very small Hubbard U. That's the limit of the long range Coulomb interaction. But you can also see that when the Hubbard U is very, very large, you sort of reproduce a Gros-Neveu theory, and the data collapses independent of the long range interaction. So what you find is sort of there are two very, very different fixed points in the system, one governed by the short range interaction and one governed by the long range interaction. So in some sense, the two kinds of interaction play out very, very differently in graphene. And of course, then since we're doing it numerically, we can solve the whole phase diagram as a function of this Hubbard U. And you can see that you can move all the way from the weakly interacting to the strongly interacting. And depending on the material you're thinking about, whether it's graphene or topological insulators or quantum corals, they all exist in different places in this phase space. And sort of we have now, with the numerics, we can sort of map out the full competition between the long range and short range Coulomb interaction. And so that's something that's sort of a complete theory for interactions in two-dimensional topological materials with strong correlations. Okay, so that was sort of the first little story that I wanted to share with you. Now, the second story I want to share is the story of anisotropy renormalization by interactions. So the question is—
Adam, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thanks, Kwek. So the question that we're asking is the following. Normally, when we're talking about a Fermi surface, we think about an isotropic Fermi surface. So the Fermi surface is circular in 2D, and that separates the occupied from unoccupied bands. And then you ask what happens with the correlations. But another question we could ask instead is what happens if you had an anisotropic Fermi surface and asked what was the role of correlations. So the question is, does the correlations make the anisotropy more or less or the same? And if I had more time, we could actually walk through different arguments. There's some arguments that might make you believe that it becomes more isotropic, others that make you believe it becomes less isotropic, and some that sort of tell you that anisotropy should remain the same. And in fact, sort of looking through this problem, I mean, we were sort of surprised that no one had really addressed this problem. I mean, the only reference we saw addressing this anisotropic Fermi surface, was a paper in 1960 by, again, Kohn and Luttiger. And they sort of say, well, we basically want to say that that perturbation theory breaks down, and diagramming perturbation theory breaks down when you have an anisotropic Fermi surface. So in some sense, and since 1960, nobody had sort of revisited this question: what happens on the role of strong correlations on an anisotropic Fermi surface? So we sort of set about trying to answer this question, and again, we applied different methods, and we used different sort of Hamiltonians to work with, and different forms of the interaction. So for example, for the non-interacting model, we could use a Dirac fermion, we could use a parabolic dispersion, we could use some sort of a topological insulator model. I mean, so there are different models we could play with, different interactions we could play with, and we could also use different methods. We've heard in the previous talk discussions about Hartree-Fock. We could use perturbation theory, RPA, quantum Monte Carlo. We can use different numerical and analytical methods to try and solve the problem. I'll just sort of go straight to the results. If you look at the first panel shows what happens to when you just have a Hubbard U and no long range. At least towards the accuracy of the numerics, you can see that it seems like there is no change in the anisotropy as a function of when you turn on the interactions. But when you put the long range Coulomb interaction, you basically see that it forms like a square root of anisotropy. So there's a renormalization of the Fermi surface of the anisotropy going as a universal square root as the previous one. And I sort of won't tell you too much more about the different tests we did. But so, for example, we tried a pi flux model, which also has a Dirac fermion, where we can control the anisotropy in a more controlled way. And again, you see it follows both in the quantum Monte Carlo and the lattice perturbation theory, follows this universal square root behavior. And again, with Hartree-Fock, we could actually solve the problem analytically. And the Hartree-Fock analytical result also gives a square root for the renormalization of the anisotropy. So why is this sort of an interesting question? Well, it's relevant for twisted bilayer graphene. I already showed you that twisted bilayer graphene has an anisotropic Fermi surface, but also for organic conductors. But also we were interested in the quantum Hall effect. So the nu equal to 1/2 quantum Hall effect. There've been experiments by Mansour Shayagan that showed that the anisotropy in those systems had a universal square root renormalization with the interactions. And so this would sort of suggest that these the idea by D.T. Son that there was a Dirac fermion present in the system seems to be supported by these by our work. Okay, let me end here and leave some time for questions. But I sort of just want to say that there's lots of other things we do. So, for example, we work on these sort of twisted systems with Morey potentials. We work on electron hydrodynamics. I didn't know that hydrodynamics was a area of the school. That's sort of something we also work on, and also in puddles and topological semi-metals. That's sort of the role of disorder. And so, with that, I'll take some questions.
Right. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes, I would have one. I mean, Shaffique, can you explain simply why? I mean, how about interaction terms diverges in the twisted bilayer graphene that you mentioned? Yeah.
So yes. So let's see. So the argument there is that so let me think about this for a second. The Hubbard U. So again, so the quantity of interest is sort of the U over T.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so one way of thinking about it is that the Fermi velocity is going to 0. The bands are getting very, very narrow. It's okay. So the way to think about it, the Hubbard U could be thought of in some way, could be thought of as the Coulomb interaction, and you divide by the size of the Morey cell.
Okay.
It's the overlap of these Morey wave functions, but then you have to divide by the number of atoms in the cell, and so the overlap is getting very, when these Morey potentials are getting very, very large, you're getting a larger overlap relative to the number of atoms that you have to begin with. So for example, in graphene, monolayer graphene, you have these 2 pi orbitals that overlap. And so you have basically some overlap between 2 orbitals divided by the total number of atoms in the cell. And so that's your baseline. And now you get these very large orbitals that sort of have overlap over a very, very large Morey-Brillouin zone. I mean, the Morey period, the wave functions are very, very large.
Okay, so this is because
very large overlap relative to how many atoms you have in this.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, thanks.
So maybe if I have a picture, I can also just show you what these orbitals look like. I'm not sure if I have a picture of these 1-year orbitals, but they're sort of very extended.
But I get the idea. I get the idea now. Okay.
So I have a question, if I can.
Mm-hmm.
So I have 2 questions. So the first one, so you mentioned that at some point you ended up with the full phase diagram, 2D phase diagram of topological materials as function interaction.
So of Dirac fermions, yes.
Right. So, and my question is, I mean, what is the underlying lattice you used? I mean, is it sort of does it depend on the underlying lattice?
So
that one you show.
Yeah. So this is a honeycomb lattice, and
okay.
The honeycomb lattice is what gives you the Dirac fermions. We did some work to see how.
I mean, it's not the only lattice where you can get the Dirac fermions,
no,
right?
You don't get it in for example, a square lattice with a pi flux. Also gives you Dirac fermions. Of course, you can get much more complicated. So, for example, if you had certain complicated 3D lattices for which the surface states would be Dirac fermions. So we didn't do an exhaustive list of all the different kinds of lattices, but we could sort of, for example, what we did do is we looked at topological lattices like for example, a pi flux versus a square lattice where you just have without the pi flux, just a square lattice. We looked at, for example, monolayer graphene is modeled with this honeycomb lattice with a tight binding model versus bilayer graphene where you have 2 two honeycomb lattices of 2 layers, and that gives you a topologically trivial state. And so we can compare topologically trivial versus topologically non-trivial in specific cases and find that this is sort of holds. But we didn't do an exhaustive search of all possible lattices.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, very quickly. So you mentioned about the square root normalization.
Yeah.
So which kind of normalization you mean? I mean, which quantity is normalized by the square root behavior?
So yeah, so we measure the anisotropy as, let's say, for example, the ky divided by kx.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sometimes it's, that would be an example of if it was an ellipse. In the real system, we might have to define a little bit more complicated notions. So, for example, for the pi flux, ky over kx is a good measure of anisotropy. But for example, for the honeycomb, you want to look at one high symmetry axis, the kk prime versus the k gamma. And so we're looking at that ratio, and how does that ratio, which sort of defines the anisotropy. So you can, for example, here see this the circle when the kk prime is the same as k gamma, you have a circle. Similarly, when kx equals to ky, you have a circle. But then as you increase anisotropy, you basically get something that sort of here is more like a triangle, and here it's more like an ellipse. So that's sort of the anisotropy. And the question would be, what happens to this anisotropy in the presence of interactions? And I can tell you that it was unexpected that we found that the long-range Coulomb, not the short-range. Short-range preserves the anisotropy, but the long-range Coulomb tail gives you a universal renormalization of the anisotropy, which is not something that was anticipated in previous theory.
Okay, thank you.
Just a short question again. About, this, perturbative expansion, okay, you show that the first term, can you compare, you showed, the picture, the one that you showed. Yes, when you compare with the first perturbation expansion, then the second expansion, this one. So you see that going, of course, if you increase the perturbation order, you get better and better, right?
Yeah, so the RPA is as you go to higher and higher order perturbation theory, you will, I guess, eventually converge to the RPA in some cases. I think in again, this is a hard problem. This is just to give you some sense. Someone I know, a colleague of mine, Ed Barnes, had calculated the fourth order perturbation diagram. It took him 1 year, and there were something like 600 diagrams he had to calculate.
Okay.
And that took him, he published a paper, and it's the fourth order calculation. So the point is that no one's done anything beyond fourth order. So we could have maybe compared this to fourth order perturbation theory, but that's the state of the art. No one has done better than that.
Is there a reason why RPA works best?
I guess it's a testament to RPA. Again, there's no a priori reason why RPA should agree with quantum Monte Carlo. Quantum Monte Carlo is numerically exact in some sense, and RPA is, the RPA sort of has this sort of property where it's sort of at every order of perturbation theory, it picks up the most divergent diagrams. So in some sense, it's sort of an order by order picking up the most important terms, and that seems to be, for many weakly interacting problems, a very good approximation. But you can see also that you go to stronger interactions and RPA starts failing. So maybe I just go to the next slide. The RPA will start failing not too far. So sort of once the cupboard U is about 0.3, the RPA then starts failing after that. So again, only for weakly interacting systems does the RPA do very well. And I think it's expected to do well for weakly interacting systems.
Right. Any other questions?
Just to go tie this into the sort of the key message I was saying. Again, depending on which range you're in, right? If you're weakly interacting, methods like RPA, like the ab initio methods that Marco talked about earlier, those kind of methods are useful, and you can go to very large system sizes. You can go to continuum models. If you're interested in very strongly interacting systems, like close to the Grosnovo phase transition, then you have to use quantum Monte Carlo. But then again, you're restricted to very, very small system sizes. So there's no magic bullet for every problem. Every sort of problem has its own sweet spot and method that might work. And sort of figuring out which method works for which problem is part of the game that we play in computational material science.
Right. Any other questions? No, if not, let's thank Shaffique for his excellent talk.